They called her Amara, a slave woman mocked as a beast of burden, forced to carry more than any man, her back bent, but her spirit unbroken. For years she endured their cruelty, until the night a boy she loved like family was whipped to death for spilling a bucket of water. That night, Amara walked into the big house with an axe in her hands and a branding iron burning red. By dawn, her masters lay dead, and the plantation was in flames. But freedom was no gift. It came with a bounty on her head, and dogs at her heels. For 2 years, she vanished into swamps, forests, and shadows, hunted by men who lived to break fugitives. She was no longer property, no longer silent. She was the most wanted woman in the South. The question is, can Amara reach true freedom before the hunters drag her back in chains? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cotton fields as Amara's muscles strained under the weight of another heavy sack. Sweat trickled down her back, soaking through her rough cotton dress despite the early hour. The bag seemed to grow heavier with each step, as she made her way between the rows, her calloused hands gripping the coarse fabric. "Move faster!" Overseer Harlan's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "You're strong as an ox, ain't you? Prove it!" Amara kept her eyes down, focusing on the earth beneath her feet. She'd learned long ago that looking up meant catching someone's eye, and catching someone's eye meant trouble. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the sack and quickened her pace slightly, just enough to avoid the overseer's ire, but not enough to drain her strength too quickly. The day was long, and she needed to conserve her energy. From the edge of the field, Master Horace Whitfield's voice carried across the rows. "Look at that one! My mule in shoes!" His laughter, cruel and sharp, drew chuckles from the men around him. "Bigger than half my field hands. Ought to hitch her to a plow and save myself the cost of a real mule." Amara's jaw tightened, but she kept moving. The cotton sack scraped against her shoulder as she walked, each step measured and careful. She could feel the other enslaved workers pulling away from her, creating distance. No one wanted to share in the mockery, to draw attention to themselves. She understood. She didn't blame them. "Amara!" Mistress Eleanor's shrill voice cut through the morning air. The woman stood at the edge of the field, her pale dress pristine in the morning light. "Come here, girl." Setting down her sack, Amara approached with her head bowed, hands clasped before her. "Yes, mistress?" Eleanor's lip curled as she examined Amara's hands. "Look at these, rough as tree bark. I needed another house girl, but with hands like these, you'd break all my fine china." She turned to her husband. "Horace, I don't know why we even tried. She's built for field work and nothing else." "That's right, my dear," Horace agreed, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "Some are born refined, and some are born beasts of burden." Amara stood still, letting their words wash over her like rain. She'd heard it all before. Too tall, too strong, too rough. The other house slaves were delicate, pretty things with soft hands and quiet steps. She was something else entirely, and they never let her forget it. A small movement caught her eye. Samuel, barely 12, struggling with his own sack of cotton. The boy was too small for such heavy work, his thin arms trembling with the effort. Without thinking, Amara shifted slightly, positioning herself between Samuel and the overseer's view. "Back to work," Harlan shouted, and Amara returned to her sack, lifting it once more. Throughout the morning, she kept track of Samuel's location in the field, making sure to stay close enough to help if needed. When Harlan's attention was elsewhere, she would take some cotton from Samuel's sack and add it to her own. The boy's grateful looks were enough to ease the extra burden. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly on the workers. Amara's dress clung to her back, soaked through with sweat, but she kept moving. She heard the whispers from the other workers, saw how they averted their eyes when she passed. Being different was dangerous here. It marked you, made you a target for the master's particular brand of cruelty. During the brief rest for their midday meal, Amara sat apart from the others, watching as Samuel picked at his meager portion of food. The boy glanced at her occasionally, uncertain but drawn to her quiet strength. Finally, he gathered his courage and moved closer to her. "Thank you," he whispered, so quietly she almost missed it, "for helping with my sack." Amara gave him a small nod, careful not to draw attention to their interaction. She broke off a piece of her cornbread and slipped it to him when no one was looking. Samuel's eyes widened at the gesture, but he quickly tucked the food away. The afternoon stretched on endlessly, the sun's heat becoming more intense. Amara's shoulders ached from the constant weight of the cotton sacks, but she didn't slow down. She noticed Samuel struggling more as the day wore on, his small frame swaying with exhaustion. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Amara and Samuel made their way back to the quarters. Their shadows stretched long across the ground, two figures of different sizes, moving in weary synchronization. "Wait here," Amara murmured as they reached the doorway of the quarters. She ducked inside and returned moments later with something wrapped in a scrap of cloth. "Here," she said, pressing it into Samuel's small hands. "Saved it from earlier." Samuel carefully unwrapped the cloth to find a piece of cornbread, larger than the one she'd given him at midday. His face lit up with a smile that seemed to chase away some of the day's darkness. "Thank you, Amara," he whispered, clutching the precious gift close. The last rays of sunlight painted the fields gold, a deceptively beautiful end to another day of endless toil. Amara watched as Samuel disappeared into the quarters, her protective instinct burning steady and warm in her chest, a quiet defiance against those who would see her only as a beast of burden. The noon sun hung mercilessly overhead as Samuel struggled with the heavy water bucket. His thin arms trembled with the effort, water sloshing over the sides as he made his way toward the field hands. Amara watched him from between the cotton rows, her heart tightening at his determined expression. The bucket was nearly as big as his torso, and sweat ran down his face as he concentrated on each step. 20 more yards to go. 15. 10. Then, his foot caught on an uneven patch of earth. Time seemed to slow as the bucket slipped from Samuel's grasp. Water arced through the air, catching the sunlight like crystal before splashing across the dusty ground. The wooden bucket hit with a hollow thud, rolling to a stop at Overseer Harlan's feet. The silence that followed was deafening. Every field hand froze, tools suspended mid-motion, as Harlan's face darkened with rage. "Boy!" His voice cracked like thunder. "Come here!" Samuel stood rooted to the spot, trembling. His eyes darted to Amara, wide with terror. Harlan closed the distance in 3 long strides, seizing Samuel by the arm. "Wasting water, you worthless little—" He dragged the boy toward the whipping post that stood like a grim sentinel at the field's edge. "Please," Samuel whimpered, his feet scrambling in the dirt. "Please, I'm sorry." Amara's body moved before her mind could catch up. "It was an accident," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "He's just a child." Harlan's backhand caught her across the face, sending her sprawling. "Keep your place, mule." The commotion drew attention from the main house. Horace Whitfield emerged onto the porch, his sons trailing behind him like eager hounds. They made their way to the whipping post, clearly anticipating the spectacle to come. "What's this, then?" Horace asked, though his amused tone suggested he already knew. "Wasting water, sir," Harlan reported, shoving Samuel against the post. "And this one," he jerked his thumb at Amara, who was pushing herself up from the ground, trying to interfere. Horace's eyes glittered with malicious delight. "Well, we can't have that, can we? Tie him up." Samuel's screams pierced the air as Harlan bound his wrists to the post. The other enslaved workers had gathered in a silent circle, their faces masks of carefully controlled emptiness. They'd seen this before. They knew the cost of intervention. 20 lashes, Horace announced, then paused as if considering. No, make it 30. Need to make sure the lesson sticks. His sons laughed, nudging each other like they were about to witness fine entertainment. Harlan uncoiled his whip, the leather singing through the air as he tested it. The first crack of the whip against Samuel's small back drew a scream that shook Amara to her core. She tried to step forward again, but strong hands held her back. Other field hands, their grip firm but gentle, saving her from sharing Samuel's fate. 1, Harlan counted, grinning. The whip fell again, and again. Samuel's screams grew weaker with each strike. Blood soaked through his shirt, running down his back in dark rivulets. 10! Horace's youngest son whooped with excitement at a particularly vicious strike. His brother clapped him on the shoulder, both of them grinning like they were at a county fair. 15! Samuel's legs had given out. He hung from his bound wrists, his body jerking with each impact. His screams had faded to weak whimpers. 20! Amara's nails dug into her palms, drawing blood. She forced herself to watch, to bear witness. Every crack of the whip, every drop of blood, every laugh from the Whitfields, she burned it all into her memory. 25! Samuel had gone silent. His head lolled forward, body limp against the post. But Harlan didn't stop. 28! I believe he's done, Horace called out, sounding almost disappointed. No point whipping a corpse. Harlan lowered the whip, breathing heavily from exertion. He cut Samuel's bonds, and the boy's body crumpled to the ground like a discarded rag doll. No one moved to help him. Well, that's that, Horace said, stretching as if he'd just finished a satisfying meal. Get back to work, all of you, and someone clean this mess up. His sons lingered a moment longer, still chuckling among themselves, before following their father back to the house. Harlan coiled his whip with practiced care, whistling tunelessly. 2 male field hands finally stepped forward to collect Samuel's body. They moved with gentle reverence, one cradling his head while the other lifted his feet. Blood dripped a trail in the dust as they carried him away. The gathered crowd dispersed silently, returning to their tasks as if nothing had happened. What else could they do? But their eyes held the same haunted look, the same carefully contained rage that burned in Amara's chest. That night, in the stifling darkness of the slave quarters, Amara lay on her rough pallet. She stared up at the ceiling beams, barely visible in the faint moonlight that filtered through the cracks. Her fists were still clenched, her nails creating fresh crescents in her palms. Samuel's screams echoed in her memory. The sound of the whip, the Whitfield's laughter, the sight of his small, broken body being carried away. Each detail was seared into her mind, feeding a fire that grew hotter with each passing moment. Something must change, she whispered to the darkness, her voice barely a breath. Something must change. The words became a rhythm, matching the pulse of fury in her blood. Something must change. The sun had long since set when Amara hefted another load of firewood toward the big house. Inside, raucous laughter and the clinking of glasses spilled from the dining room windows. The Whitfields were celebrating something. She neither knew nor cared what. All she knew was that they'd been drinking since sundown. Through the kitchen window, she could see the slaves preparing more food. Roasted duck, sweet potatoes, cornbread. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She had other things on her mind tonight. The woodpile stood in shadow beside the kitchen door. As she set down her burden, her eyes fixed on the axe planted in the chopping block. Its handle was smooth from years of use, its head gleaming dully in the lamplight from the kitchen. Without hesitation, she pulled it free and tucked it behind a stack of logs. She'd return for it soon. Inside the kitchen was chaos. The cook, Martha, barked orders while stoking the fire. 2 young girls darted between tables laden with food. And there, near the hearth, sat the branding irons. They glowed orange hot in the flames, ready for tomorrow's work. Horace had mentioned marking new cattle at dawn. "More wood!" Martha called without looking up. Amara gathered an armload, careful to keep her movements steady and unremarkable. As she fed logs into the fire, she studied the branding irons. Their handles stuck out like accusing fingers. From the dining room came another burst of drunken laughter. A glass shattered, followed by Horace's booming voice. "Another round! We're celebrating!" Amara slipped back outside. The night air was thick with humidity, pressing against her skin like a wet blanket. Crickets chirped in the darkness. An owl called from somewhere in the cotton fields. Everything felt heightened, more intense, as if the world itself held its breath. She retrieved the axe from its hiding place, testing its weight. The handle fit her calloused palm perfectly. How many hours had she spent splitting wood with this very tool? Now it would split something else. Moving silently, she crept to the kitchen door. Martha and the girls were occupied with a fresh batch of cornbread. The branding iron still glowed in the fire. Amara's heart thundered in her chest, but her hands were steady as she lifted one from the flames. The metal radiated heat, promising pain. More laughter erupted from the dining room. Horace's voice carried clearly. "Pour another." "When I say celebrate, boy, I mean celebrate." Amara moved through the kitchen like a shadow. The serving girls didn't even glance her way. She was invisible to them, as always. She paused at the dining room door, listening to the chaos within. Glasses clinked. Chairs scraped across the floor. Someone was singing badly. She took a deep breath, remembering Samuel's screams, his blood in the dust, the way Horace and his sons had laughed. The door swung open silently under her touch. The scene before her was one of drunken excess. Empty bottles littered the table. Food lay half-eaten on fine china, and the Whitfields sprawled in their chairs like bloated lords. Horace sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with wine. His eldest son, James, was attempting to stand, using the table for support. The younger son, William, had his head thrown back in laughter. None of them noticed her until the axe was already swinging. It caught Horace in the side of his neck with a wet thunk. His eyes went wide with shock, wineglass slipping from his fingers to shatter on the floor. Before anyone could react, Amara wrenched the axe free and swung again, this time into his chest. James lunged forward with a roar of rage, but drink made him clumsy. The axe met his charge, biting deep into his shoulder. He stumbled, crying out in pain and surprise. Amara kicked him hard in the chest, sending him crashing into the table. William scrambled backward, knocking over his chair. "Help!" he screamed. "Murder! The slaves are—" The branding iron cut off his words as Amara drove it into his face. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, mixing with the wine and food. William's screams were inhuman as he clawed at his ruined features. She pressed the iron against his chest next, holding it there as he thrashed. Somewhere in the house, people were shouting. Feet pounded on wooden floors. Amara grabbed one of the oil lamps from the table and hurled it at the heavy curtains. Flames leaped up immediately, hungry for the expensive fabric. She threw another lamp, and another, until fire raced along the walls. Smoke began to fill the room. Through it, she could see Horace's body slumped over the table, blood pooling beneath him. James lay motionless where he'd fallen. William writhed on the floor, still screaming, his face and chest a ruined mess. Outside, chaos erupted. Slaves ran in all directions, some toward the quarters, others into the fields. A few stood frozen, staring at the growing inferno with expressions of mingled terror and awe. The fire was spreading fast now, eating through the dry wood of the house like it was starved. Heat pressed against Amara's back as she burst through the front door into the night air. The axe hung heavy in her grip, its head dark with blood. Soot streaked her face and arms, and her clothes reeked of smoke. Behind her, the screams of the dying mixed with the roar of flames. She didn't stop to watch. The darkness of the fields beckoned, promising escape. Each step carried her further from the chains that had bound her, from the cruelty that had killed Samuel, from the life she'd endured for so long. The screams followed her into the night, but they grew fainter with each stride. The fire cast her shadow long before her, a giant fleeing across the cotton rows. She ran, and with each footfall, she felt something new rising in her chest. Not quite freedom, not yet, but its wild and terrible beginning. Dawn had not yet broken when Amara pressed herself against a massive oak tree, her chest heaving. The night's events felt like a fever dream, but the blood dried on her hands and clothes told a different story. Church bells rang in the distance, not for prayer, but for alarm. Their urgent pealing carried through the thick morning air, calling men to hunt. She looked down at the axe still clutched in her grip. Its weight, once familiar from countless hours of labor, now felt like a burden. The dried blood along its edge had turned almost black. After a moment's consideration, she buried it beneath a pile of leaves and rotting branches. She couldn't afford anything that might slow her down. The woods were coming alive with early morning sounds, birds calling, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. But beneath these natural noises, she caught others that made her pulse quicken. Distant shouts, the crack of branches under heavy boots, the occasional whinny of horses being readied for the chase. Amara moved northward, keeping low and careful. Years of working the plantation had taught her the layout of the surrounding wilderness. She knew where the swamps lay, thick with cypress trees and hanging moss. They would slow pursuers and hide her tracks. The trick would be reaching them without being seen. The sun rose higher, burning off the morning mist. The bells had stopped, replaced by the sounds of organized pursuit. Men's voices carried through the trees, growing closer, then fading as search parties passed. They called her name sometimes, their tones mixing false concern with underlying menace. "Amara, show yourself, girl. Make it easier on everyone." She recognized Overseer Harlan's voice among them and pressed deeper into a thicket of brambles, ignoring the thorns that tore at her skin. The horses wouldn't be able to follow through here. She could hear their frustrated stamping and the cursing of their riders as they were forced to circle around. By midday, the woods echoed with activity. More men had joined the search, not just from the plantation, but neighboring farms too. They shouted descriptions of her to each other. "Tall woman, strong-built, dark-skinned, got a scar above her right eye. Might still be carrying the axe. Approach with caution." Amara touched the scar they mentioned, a gift from Horace's walking stick 2 summers ago. Now it would help them identify her. She pulled a strip of cloth from her dress and tied it around her forehead, covering the mark. The swamp was close now. She could smell its distinctive mix of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. The ground had become softer, threading with shallow streams and boggy patches. She stepped carefully, using exposed tree roots and higher ground to avoid leaving tracks. A shot rang out somewhere behind her, making her jump. It was followed by excited shouting that quickly turned to disappointment. They'd probably spotted a deer or wild pig. But the sound drove home the reality of her situation. They weren't just hunting to capture. The next few days blurred together in a haze of constant movement and fear. She caught snippets of sleep in hollow logs and dense thickets, never staying in one place for long. Food was whatever she could grab quickly. Berries, raw wild onions, even tree bark when hunger gnawed too sharply. On the 4th day, she saw the first poster nailed to a tree near a crossroads. Even though she couldn't read the words, her own face stared back at her, rendered in harsh black strokes. The amount listed beneath must have been substantial, judging by how many copies she began seeing tacked to trees and fence posts. The wanted posters brought new hunters. These weren't just plantation men, but professionals, slave catchers with their trained dogs and mercenaries looking to claim the bounty. They moved differently through the woods, with more skill and purpose. Sometimes she heard their hounds baying in the distance, and only the swamp's waters saved her from their noses. A week after the fire, Amara knelt beside a creek as dusk painted the sky in deep purples and blues. Her dress hung in tatters, caked with mud and other stains. Hunger had already begun to hollow her cheeks, but her eyes, when she caught their reflection in the water, burned with the same determination that had driven her to take up the axe. She cupped water in her hands, washing away some of the grime from her face. The creek ran clear and sweet, offering her first real chance to clean herself since the night of fire. As she worked, she could hear night birds beginning their songs in the trees above. Soon it would be dark enough to move again. 2 years, she whispered to her wavering reflection, her voice rough from disuse. I will not be caught. The words felt like a vow, solid and binding as iron. She had no way of knowing if 2 years would be enough, no way to guess what lay ahead. But she had endured 28 years of bondage. Whatever came next, hunger, dogs, bullets, none of it could be worse than returning to chains. The light was failing fast now. Somewhere in the growing darkness, men still searched, dogs still sniffed the air, and her face still stared out from wanted posters. But for this moment, as she crouched by the creek's edge, Amara allowed herself to feel something like peace. She had chosen her path. Now she would walk it, no matter where it led. Dawn crept over the swamp like a hesitant visitor, filtering through the Spanish moss in pale strips. Amara lay still in the murky water, only her nose and eyes above the surface. The baying of hounds echoed through the cypress trees, closer now than before. 6 months of running had changed her. Her body, once strong from plantation labor, had become lean and wiry. Every muscle had learned to move in silence, every sense sharpened by constant danger. The swamp water around her was cold enough to make her bones ache, but she didn't dare move yet. "The tracks lead this way!" A man's voice carried across the water, followed by splashing. The dog's excited barking grew louder. Amara sank deeper, letting the dark water cover her completely. She'd learned early that swamp water confused the hounds. It was one of many lessons bought with close calls and desperate flights. Through the murk, she could see the rippling shadows of men waiting nearby, their curses at the deep mud bringing a grim satisfaction. When she finally surfaced, an hour later, the hunters had moved on. Her lips were blue with cold, but she was alive. Another day of freedom earned through cunning and endurance. The passing months had taught her to survive in ways she'd never imagined. Early on, she'd nearly died trying to eat unfamiliar berries. Now she could identify which plants would feed her and which would kill. She'd learned to move through darkness like it was daylight, to read weather from cloud patterns, to tell which farmhouses might have food stored in their cellars. One muggy night in late summer, she crept toward a small farmhouse where a single candle burned. The family's washing hung on a line, the first clean clothes she'd seen in weeks. Her own dress had become more holes than fabric. Moving like a shadow, she took a plain brown dress and a shawl, leaving her rags hanging in their place. The new clothes helped her blend in better when she had to risk passing near settlements. The stolen dress saved her life a week later. Slave catchers rode past while she worked in plain sight, pretending to gather herbs by a roadside. They looked right through her, expecting a wild woman in tatters, not someone who could pass for a free domestic servant. Their horses' hooves kicked up dust that settled on her clean skirt as they passed, but trust was rare as gold dust. A free black family took her in one night, sharing their meager supper. By morning, Their neighbor had noticed the extra plate at their table. Amara fled just ahead of the slave patrol, hearing the family's door being broken down behind her. The guilt of bringing trouble to those who helped her sat heavy in her stomach for days. In early fall, she found shelter with a small band of Cherokee people who recognized another soul pushed from their rightful place. They showed her how to move through forests, leaving no trace, how to cover great distances without tiring. But even they couldn't risk harboring her for long. Too many eyes watched their camp. Too many treaties hung by threads. Winter brought new challenges. Food grew scarce, and cold became as dangerous as any hunter. She learned to sleep in hollow trees padded with dry leaves, to trap small game using methods gleaned from watching wolves, to find nuts and roots buried under snow. Every skill came at a price, usually paid in hunger, pain, or fear. The legends began spreading among the enslaved communities she passed near. At first, she only caught fragments of whispered conversations. Killed the master with his own tools, 2 sons dead, 1 marked forever, still free after all these months. Her story grew with each telling. Some said she was 7 feet tall, strong as 10 men. Others claimed she could turn into smoke to escape chains, or that bullets couldn't harm her. The truth was both simpler and harder. She survived through endless vigilance and the determination that had been building through years of abuse. A year into her flight, she had a close call that nearly ended everything. She'd grown too confident, too comfortable with her routine of stealing and hiding. The farm she chose for food had seemed empty, but the owner returned early. The bullet caught her arm as she fled, leaving a furrow of fire across her skin. She ran for 3 days straight, sleeping only in short bursts, before she felt safe enough to tend the wound. The scar from that bullet joined others earned during her flight, a collection of marks that mapped her journey toward freedom. Each one reminded her of lessons learned. Never trust easily, never stay too long, never assume safety. Some nights, when the cold or hunger or loneliness pressed too hard, she thought of returning. Surely death would be quicker than this endless chase. But then she would remember Samuel's face, hear his screams mixing with the crack of the whip, and her resolve would harden again. She had killed for him, burned a plantation for him. She would not waste his sacrifice by surrendering now. Snow filtered through gaps in the barn's roof, dusting Amara's shoulders as she huddled in the loft. The winter wind found every hole in the wooden walls, but it was still warmer than sleeping in the open. Somewhere beyond these walls, dogs might be searching. Men might be reading descriptions of her face by lamplight. But for now, there was only the quiet fall of snow and the soft sound of horses shifting in their stalls below. "Samuel," she whispered into the darkness, her breath visible in the cold air. The name gave her strength, as it had so many times before. She pulled her stolen shawl tighter, remembering his small hands, his trusting eyes, his final moments. "Samuel, I'm still free, still fighting." The snow continued to fall, adding another layer to the white blanket that covered her tracks outside. By morning, she would need to move again, find new shelter, stay ahead of the endless pursuit. But for now, she allowed herself this moment of rest, whispering the name that had become both wound and weapon. Samuel. Spring brought a deceptive warmth to the wilderness, coaxing green buds from bare branches. Amara's worn boots carried her down a muddy path toward a small settlement, her steps heavy with exhaustion. 2 years of constant movement had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones and whittled her strong frame to lean muscle and tendon. The white chapel stood out against the dreary landscape, its wooden cross reaching toward gray clouds. Smoke curled from several chimneys, promising warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. Her stomach cramped at the thought of real food, something besides the nuts and dried meat that had sustained her through winter. Preacher Collins found her swaying on the chapel steps, her vision blurring from hunger and fatigue. He was a tall man with gentle eyes and silver at his temples, wearing a black coat that marked him as a man of God. "Child," he said softly, reaching for her arm, "you look half dead from walking. Come inside where it's warm." Amara flinched at his touch, but the kindness in his voice made her throat tight with longing. How long had it been since anyone had spoken to her with such tenderness? I can't stay," she managed, though her legs trembled with the effort of standing. "Nonsense." Collins guided her through the chapel doors. "The Lord sends lost sheep to those who can shelter them." Matthew 25:35. "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." The chapel's interior smelled of pine smoke and beeswax. Collins led her to a small room behind the pulpit, where a fire crackled in a stone hearth. His wife, a plump woman with work-roughened hands, brought bread and soup without asking questions. "Eat slowly," Collins advised, settling into a wooden chair. "Then we'll talk about how best to help you." Amara forced herself to take small bites, though her hands shook with the effort of restraint. The soup was simple, just vegetables and broth, but it was the first hot food she'd tasted in months. "The Lord delivers those who suffer unjustly," Collins said, watching her eat. Psalm 34:17. "When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles." His words washed over her like warm water, easing the constant tension in her shoulders. After she finished eating, Collins's wife showed her to a small back room with a narrow bed. "Rest," the woman said, closing the door softly. Amara lay down fully clothed, her boots still on. Even through her exhaustion, years of vigilance made her catalog escape routes. One window, 2 doors, a steep drop to the ground outside. But the bed was soft, and the room was warm, and soon even her weariness couldn't keep her eyes open. She slept deeply for the first time in months, not stirring until evening shadows stretched across the floor. The chapel was quiet, except for distant voices, Collins speaking to someone in low tones. Something in those muffled words made her skin prickle. She crept to the door, pressing her ear against wood worn smooth by time. "Matched the description exactly," Collins was saying. "Tall woman, strong-built, scar on her right eye, just like the posters said." "And you're certain she's still here?" A stranger's voice, rough with tobacco. "Sleeping in the back room. Didn't suspect a thing when I quoted scripture at her. Poor thing was too hungry to notice I was watching her hands for burn scars." Amara's heart thundered against her ribs. Fool, 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 to think sanctuary could be so easily found. She grabbed her shawl, easing the window open as voices drew closer to her door. The drop was higher than she'd estimated, but she landed in a crouch, just as boots thundered down the chapel's hall. A shout went up. They'd found the empty room. She ran for the tree line, but mounted riders emerged from the shadows, cutting off her escape. 5 men with guns and dogs, moving to surround her. "There's nowhere to run, girl," one called out. "Come quiet, and we won't have to hurt you." Amara's hand found a broken fence post, pulled loose from wet spring soil. She'd survived too much, run too far, to surrender now. The first hunter came at her with a rope. She swung the post hard, feeling it connect with his temple. He dropped without a sound. Another rushed in as his friend fell, but 2 years of desperate living had made her dangerous. The post caught him in the throat. A third man grabbed her from behind. She drove her elbow into his ribs, heard the crack of bone, but not before his knife opened a long cut on her arm. Blood ran hot down her sleeve as she wrenched free. Through the chaos, she glimpsed Collins watching from the chapel steps, his Bible clutched to his chest. Their eyes met for a moment, hers full of fury, his wide with fear of what he'd unleashed. A bullet whined past her ear. She dove into the underbrush as more shots split the evening air. The post caught another hunter across the face as he reached for her, a tall man with cold eyes. His scream followed her into the darkness as she ran, the wound deep enough to leave a scar he'd carry forever. Branches whipped her face as she crashed through the forest. The dog's barking grew distant. She'd learned long ago to run through water when she could, to confuse their tracking. But betrayal hurt worse than the cut on her arm, worse than the bruises from her falls. "Damn you, Collins," she gasped, stumbling over fallen logs. "Damn your false prayers and your lying tongue." Blood dripped from her fingers, marking her trail until she could stop to bind the wound. But she couldn't stop yet. Not with the hunters behind her. Not with their dogs still baying in the distance. She pressed her hand against the cut, cursing herself for believing in sanctuary, for thinking any place could be safe, while a price remained on her head. The weakness of hope had nearly destroyed her. She wouldn't make that mistake again. 3 nights of hard rain had swollen the Mississippi River, its dark waters churning beneath a clouded moon. Amara crouched in the shadows of wooden crates on the riverbank, watching the ferry workers secure their ropes for the night crossing. Her arm still ached where Collins's hunter had cut her. The wound barely healed beneath dirty bandages. The ferry was simple, a flat wooden barge guided by poles and ropes, but it represented her best chance to put the great river between herself and those who hunted her. She'd watched for days, learning the patterns of the ferrymen, noting when they were most careless in their checks. Tonight, the rain worked in her favor. The men hurried through their tasks, eager to get out of the downpour. Amara slipped from shadow to shadow, her feet silent on the wet planks. She wedged herself between stacks of cotton bales, pulling a piece of torn canvas over her body. The rough fabric scratched her skin, but she didn't dare move. The ferry creaked and swayed as it pushed away from shore. Water splashed over the sides, soaking through the canvas. Amara held her breath when footsteps passed near her hiding place, but the workers were more concerned with keeping their balance than checking their cargo. The crossing seemed to take hours. Every wave that rocked the ferry made Amara's stomach clench with fear of discovery. But gradually, the eastern shore fell away behind them, and new lights appeared ahead. The dim glow of a river town coming alive in the pre-dawn hours. When the ferry bumped against the far dock, Amara waited until the workers began unloading the opposite end. Then she slipped over the side, dropping silently into knee-deep water. The cold shocked her bones, but she waded to shore beneath the dock's shadow. The town was bigger than she'd expected, its streets laid out in a grid that stretched away from the river. Market stalls stood empty, waiting for dawn. Amara moved quickly through the quiet lanes, noting places to hide if needed. Her wet clothes marked her passage, but few people were awake to see. She found what she was looking for behind a chandler's shop, a pile of discarded clothes waiting to be burned. From these, she selected a faded dress and apron that might have belonged to a servant. They smelled of tallow and smoke, but they were dry. Next, she needed a story. In 2 years of running, Amara had learned that people remembered details, especially about tall, strong women traveling alone. But they paid little attention to servants, and even less to those who couldn't speak. She bound her hair tightly beneath a scarf and practiced keeping her eyes down. Her shoulders slumped. When the market opened, she approached a washerwoman setting up her stand, gesturing to her throat and making helpless sounds. The woman's face softened with pity. "Can't speak, child? Poor thing. Looking for work?" Amara nodded eagerly, pointing to the woman's washtubs. "Well, I can't pay much, but there's more work than my old hands can manage. You know how to get stains out of fine cloth?" Another nod. Amara had spent years washing the Whitfields' clothes, though the memory made bile rise in her throat. The washerwoman, Malaya was her name, proved kind enough. She showed Amara to a tiny shack behind her house, where previous helpers had stayed. The roof leaked, and mice had chewed holes in the walls, but it was shelter. "2 coins a week," Malaya said, "and you can stay here. We start at dawn tomorrow." Amara paid with stolen money, her hands shaking as she counted out the coins, but Malaya just pocketed them with a nod, asking no questions about where a mute washerwoman might have gotten such funds. Days passed, then weeks. Amara's hands grew raw from lye soap and hot water, but the work was familiar. She learned the rhythm of the town, when the riverboats came in, which houses sent the most laundry, how to avoid the constable's daily patrols. She watched families from the corners of her eyes as she delivered clean clothes. Children played in the streets, while mothers called them in for supper. Men smoked pipes on their porches, trading news and jokes. Even the poorest homes had warmth and voices inside. Sometimes, in the quiet evening hours, Amara allowed herself to imagine belonging to such a place. She thought about renting a real room, saving enough coins to buy proper dresses. Perhaps she could learn to write, to keep accounts for the wash house. Malaya was getting older, maybe in time, but she never completed these thoughts. They were dangerous dreams, soft things that could destroy her if she believed in them too deeply. Still, she couldn't help noticing how the townspeople began to accept her presence. They nodded as she passed, carrying her baskets of laundry. Some even learned to communicate with gestures, asking about specific stains or delivery times. For 6 weeks, Amara lived in the space between terror and hope. She jumped at shadows, but also learned to breathe more slowly. She kept her escape routes planned, but also bought a tin cup for her morning coffee. Small things, quiet things, the taste of what freedom might be. Then came the evening that shattered everything. The market was closing, stall keepers packing away their goods as the sun set. Amara carried her last basket of folded laundry, planning to deliver it before dark. The familiar weight of clean cloth against her hip had become almost comforting. She rounded the corner near the butcher's shop, her mind on supper and tomorrow's washing. Movement caught her eye. A tall man limping down the street, one hand resting on a knife handle. Even before she saw his face, she knew. The scar she'd given him had healed badly, twisting one side of his mouth into a permanent snarl. He moved slower than before, favoring his right leg, but his eyes were sharp as they scanned the crowd. Amara froze mid-step, her fingers clenching the laundry basket. For a heartbeat, she thought he might pass without seeing her. Then his head began to turn toward where she stood. Dawn crept over the river town in pale gray streaks. Amara moved like a shadow through Malaya's yard, her few possessions wrapped in a stolen blanket. Her hand shook as she left 2 coins on the wash-house step, payment for the clothes she wore and the bread in her bundle. The streets were empty except for delivery boys setting up their morning routes. Amara kept to the alleys, moving steadily toward the edge of town. Her heart ached with each step away from the fragile peace she'd built. But she'd seen the hunter's eyes last night, watched him questioning merchants in the market. He would find her soon, if she stayed. She reached the tree line just as the sun cleared the horizon. The forest welcomed her back with familiar sounds, birds calling their morning songs, leaves rustling in the breeze. Amara didn't stop to rest. She knew the hunters would discover her absence within hours. By midday, she heard the first baying of hounds in the distance. The sound sent ice through her veins, but she forced herself to think clearly. She'd learned much in 2 years of running. She waded through streams to confuse her scent, doubled back on her own trail, and used fallen trees to stay off the ground when possible. But the dogs kept coming. Their howls grew closer as afternoon faded into evening. Amara's legs burned from hours of running, and her throat was raw with thirst. The ground beneath her feet grew softer, wetter. She was entering swamp country. The first trap nearly took her foot, metal teeth snapping shut inches from her ankle. After that, she had to move slower, watching for telltale signs in the mud. The hunters had prepared this ground, turning the swamp itself into a weapon against her. Night fell, but the pursuit didn't stop. Lanterns bobbed through the trees behind her, accompanied by shouts and the splashing of horses in shallow water. Amara's foot slipped, and she fell hard against a cypress knee. The impact drove the air from her lungs. Before she could rise, a huge shape burst from the darkness. One of the hounds. Amara rolled as its jaws snapped at her throat. Her hand found a fallen branch, and she swung it with all her strength. The dog yelped as wood met bone. But there were more dogs coming. Amara scrambled up, pulling the knife she'd stolen from Martha's kitchen. When the next hound leaped, she met it with steel instead of wood. Hot blood sprayed across her arms as the blade found its mark. "There, by the big cypress," a hunter's voice carried across the water. Lantern light swept toward her position. Amara ran, splashing through knee-deep water. Roots and vines caught at her skirts. She heard cursing behind her as the hunters navigated the treacherous ground. But they were gaining. She could hear their boots squelching in the mud, smell the tobacco on their breath. Something hard struck her shoulder, spinning her around. One of the hunters had thrown a club. Before she could recover her balance, the remaining dogs were on her. Pain exploded in her leg as powerful jaws clamped down. Amara screamed for the first time since leaving the plantation, a sound of pure rage and defiance. She plunged her knife into the dog's neck, but not before its teeth had torn deep into her flesh. Another dog caught her arm, shaking her like a rag doll. She kicked and thrashed, feeling skin tear and muscles strain. The knife slipped from her bloody fingers. The hunters were almost upon her now. She saw the scarred one's face in the lantern light, twisted with savage satisfaction. In that moment, Amara made her choice. She threw herself backward into deeper water, dragging the dogs with her. Their grip loosened as they fought to stay afloat. The dark water closed over her head, tasting of mud and rotting plants. "Shoot her!" someone yelled. But another voice cut through the chaos. "Wait! The gators!" Amara kicked hard, pushing away from the struggling dogs. Her lungs burned as she swam underwater, letting the current pull her deeper into the swamp. Something large moved past her in the darkness, a scaled body sliding through the murk. She heard splashing and yelping above, then gunshots that sounded muffled through the water. She stayed under as long as she could, surfacing only when her vision started to go dark. When she finally raised her head, she was far enough from the hunters that their lanterns looked like fireflies among the trees. But she wasn't safe. Every movement sent waves of agony through her torn flesh. The water around her was stained pink, and she knew the scent of blood would draw predators. Her body felt impossibly heavy as she forced herself to keep moving. The moon rose, casting weak light through the cypress canopy. Amara could barely see where she was going, but she pushed forward, using floating logs and low-hanging branches to rest. When her strength failed, time lost meaning. She might have swum and drifted for hours or days. The wounds on her leg and arm throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Fever made the trees dance and waver, turning shadows into reaching hands. Finally, when the sky was turning purple with approaching dawn, Amara's feet touched something solid. She crawled forward on trembling arms, pulling herself onto a mud bank thick with rotting vegetation. Her entire body shook with exhaustion and cold. The bundle containing her few possessions was long gone, lost in that first desperate plunge into the water. Her dress hung in blood-stained tatters, and the stolen knife had disappeared into the swamp's depths. She had nothing left except the breath in her lungs and the stubborn beat of her heart. Amara collapsed onto her side, too weak to move further. The mud was cool against her fevered skin. Around her, the swamp began to wake with morning sounds, frogs calling, birds stirring, insects humming. but she barely heard them through the roaring in her ears as consciousness slipped away. The forest spun around Amara as she stumbled between the trees. 2 days had passed since the swamp, or maybe 3. Time blurred in her fever-addled mind. The dog bites on her arm, and leg burned like hot coals, and her skin felt tight and hot. She had tried cleaning the wounds in a stream, but infection had already set in. Each step sent daggers of pain through her body. Torn cloth from her dress served as makeshift bandages, now stiff with dried blood and swamp muck. The morning sun, filtering through the leaves, seemed too bright, making her head pound. Amara's throat was parched, her lips cracked and bleeding. She had found water, but keeping it down was another matter. Her stomach rejected everything. A branch caught her foot, and she fell hard against a tree trunk. The rough bark scraped her palms as she tried to steady herself. The world tilted, sickeningly. Through her fever haze, she thought she heard Samuel's voice calling her name, but Samuel was dead. She had watched him die. "Have to keep moving," she mumbled, though her words came out slurred. The hunters might still be searching. They always searched. Pushing off from the tree, Amara forced herself to walk, one foot in front of the other. Don't think about the pain. Don't think about anything except the next step. The trees thinned suddenly, opening onto cleared land. Through her blurred vision, Amara made out the shapes of a small farmhouse and barn. A vegetable garden stretched alongside the house, and chickens scratched in the yard. Her fevered mind screamed danger. A farm meant people, and people meant betrayal. But her body had reached its limit. Her legs buckled, and she fell to her knees in the tall grass at the forest's edge. The last thing she saw was a woman running toward her from the garden, a basket of vegetables dropped forgotten in the dirt. Then darkness swept over her like a heavy blanket. Consciousness returned in fragments. Cool cloth on her forehead, the taste of broth on her lips, soft voices speaking in hushed tones, pain as gentle hands cleaned her wounds. "The fever's breaking," someone said, "but these bites are bad. Dog marks, looks like." "Poor child," another voice answered. "What devil set hounds on her?" Amara tried to speak, to warn them about the hunters, but only a weak moan escaped her lips. "Shh, rest now," the first voice soothed. "You're safe here." Time passed in a haze of fever dreams. She was back on the plantation, then running through endless swamps, then floating in dark water while massive shapes moved beneath her. Through it all, those gentle hands tended her, coaxing water and broth past her cracked lips, changing bandages, and bathing her fevered skin with cool cloths. When Amara finally opened her eyes with a clear mind, she found herself lying on a narrow bed in a small, clean room. Sunlight streamed through a window, and a cool breeze stirred the curtains. Her wounds had been properly bandaged, and she wore a fresh cotton nightgown. A black woman sat in a rocking chair beside the bed, quilting by the window's light. She was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair tied back in a neat scarf and kind eyes in a face marked by laugh lines. She looked up as Amara stirred. "Welcome back to the land of the living," the woman said, setting aside her quilting. "I'm Ruth. You've been here 4 days now." Amara tried to sit up, but her body protested the movement. Ruth quickly moved to help her, adjusting pillows behind her back. "The hunters," Amara croaked, her voice rough from disuse. "Haven't been seen," Ruth assured her. "This is my farm, and I keep a close watch. No one comes here without my knowing." She poured water from a pitcher and helped Amara drink. The cool liquid felt like heaven on her parched throat. "Why?" Amara asked when she could speak again. "Why help me?" Ruth's eyes softened. "Because you needed help, child. And because I've seen that haunted look before, in others who've run far and hard for freedom." She sat back in her chair, studying Amara's face. "I know who you are. Word travels, even out here. The woman who killed her masters and escaped. 2 years on the run, they say. Amara tensed, waiting for judgment or fear. But Ruth just nodded slowly. Must have been something terrible to push you to such lengths, she said quietly. But that's your story to tell or keep. She stood and went to the window, checking the yard before drawing the curtains against the fading light. When she turned back, her expression was serious. What matters now is healing you and getting you to safety. The scars on your back tell me you were born in chains, like my mother was. But I was born free, thank God. And I mean to help others find that same freedom. Moving to a chest against the wall, Ruth opened it and removed several items, a map, some letters, and a small book. She laid them on the bed beside Amara. There's a network, she explained, keeping her voice low, though they were alone in the house. People like me, both black and white, who help runners reach free soil. We call it the Underground Railroad, though there's no trains involved, just courage and determination. Night had fallen outside, crickets beginning their evening chorus. A candle burned on the bedside table, casting warm light across Ruth's face as she leaned closer. You've already shown more courage than most, she said softly. Running for 2 years, surviving dogs and swamps, and who knows what else. But you don't have to run alone anymore. Ruth's hand found Amara's, squeezing gently. There is a way north, she said. When you're strong enough, I'll show you the path. Dawn crept through the shutters, painting stripes of golden light across Amara's bed. She had been at Ruth's cabin for nearly 2 weeks now, and her body was slowly healing. The dog bites no longer burned with fever, though the scars would remain, new marks to join the old ones that mapped her history of pain. Amara touched the fresh bandage on her arm, remembering Ruth's gentle hands changing it the night before. Such kindness still felt strange, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. 2 years of running had taught her to expect betrayal behind every helping hand. The floorboards creaked softly as Ruth entered, carrying a steaming bowl. The older woman's face brightened at seeing Amara awake. "Good morning, child. Strong enough to sit up for breakfast?" Amara nodded, carefully pushing herself upright. Her muscles protested less each day. Ruth set the bowl of cornmeal porridge on the small table beside the bed and helped adjust the pillows behind Amara's back. "You're getting better at that," Ruth observed. "Soon you'll be strong enough to help me in the garden." The porridge was sweetened with molasses, a luxury Amara hadn't tasted since before her escape. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, while Ruth settled into her rocking chair with her mending. "Tell me about the others," Amara said after a while. She had been curious about Ruth's hints of helping other runaways, but fear had kept her from asking until now. Ruth's weathered hands stilled on her work. She glanced at the window before speaking, a habit Amara recognized from her own vigilance. "There have been many over the years," Ruth said softly. "Young mothers with babies, old men bent from decades in the fields, children sent north by desperate parents. Each one carried their own story of survival." She set aside her mending and leaned forward, her voice dropping lower. "There was a young man last spring, not much older than you. He'd been sold away from his wife and infant son, walked hundreds of miles trying to get back to them, only to learn they'd been sold again. Nearly broke his spirit." "What happened to him?" Amara asked. "Got him to Canada. Last letter said he's working as a carpenter there, saving money to buy his family's freedom legally." Ruth smiled. "He sends what he can to help others escape. That's how the network grows, each one reaching back to lift another." Amara's throat tightened. She thought of Samuel, of all the others she'd left behind that terrible night. The guilt of running alone had haunted her almost as much as the hunters. "A woman came through last summer," Ruth continued, "carrying burns like yours. Said her master used her skin like paper to write his cruelty. She stayed here 3 weeks, healing like you are now. When she left, She told me it was the first time since childhood anyone had touched her with gentleness. Something warm and wet rolled down Amara's cheek. She reached up, surprised to find tears falling. Ruth moved to sit on the edge of the bed, taking Amara's calloused hands in her own. "Let it come," she said softly. "Tears aren't weakness. They're the rain that helps heal the drought inside us." And like a dam breaking, Amara's tears flowed freely. She wept for Samuel's broken body, for the woman with burns, for the father separated from his child, for herself, and all the horror she had carried alone for so long. Ruth held her through it, humming softly and stroking her hair as a mother might. When the tears finally slowed, Amara felt lighter somehow, as if poison had been drawn from a wound. Ruth handed her a handkerchief and returned to her chair, giving her space to compose herself. The morning passed quietly after that. Ruth taught Amara to knit, laughing gently at her clumsy first attempts with the needles. They shared stories, Ruth of her mother's escape north, carrying Ruth as an infant, Amara of the small acts of rebellion that had kept her spirit alive during her enslavement. Just past noon, they heard hoofbeats on the road. Ruth's body tensed, though her voice remained calm. "Time for you to see another part of my house," she said, helping Amara to her feet. "Can you walk?" Amara nodded, leaning on Ruth's arm as they moved to the corner of the room. Ruth knelt and lifted a small rug, revealing a trap door so cleverly built into the floorboards that Amara hadn't noticed it before. The space below was narrow but clean, lined with quilts and supplied with a water jug and chamber pot. Ruth helped Amara down, then passed her a small oil lamp. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear," she whispered. "I'll knock 3 times when it's safe." The trap door closed silently, and darkness wrapped around Amara like a familiar blanket. She heard Ruth's footsteps moving away, then the scrape of her rocking chair being returned to its place. Moments later, heavy boots thudded on the porch. A man's voice called out, "Anyone home?" "Just me," Ruth answered. Amara marveled at how steady her voice sounded. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Looking for a runaway," a different voice said. "Tall woman, strong built. Might be injured. Seen anyone matching that description?" "Can't say that I have," Ruth replied. "Don't get many travelers out this way, especially not now with the spring planting to do." Boots crossed the floor above Amara's head. Through gaps in the boards, she could see shadows moving across the room. Her heart hammered so loud she feared they might hear it. "Mind if we look around?" the first voice asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Help yourselves," Ruth said calmly. "Though I'd appreciate if you'd wipe your boots first. Just cleaned my floors yesterday." More footsteps, moving through the house. Drawers opening and closing. A cupboard door creaking. Amara pressed herself flat against the dirt floor, scarcely breathing. "Nothing here," someone called from another room. "Just an old woman's things." The boots returned, pausing near the trap door. Amara could see the mud caked on them through the cracks. "If you do see anyone suspicious," the second voice said, "there's a reward. Good money for information about this one." "I'll keep that in mind," Ruth answered. "Good day to you, gentle." The boots moved away. A door closed. Hoofbeats faded into distance. Amara waited in the dark, counting her heartbeats until Ruth's promised signal came. 3 soft knocks above her head. A week had passed since the hunter's visit. Ruth stood at her cabin door in the pre-dawn light, scanning the tree line. Her worn leather bag was packed with dried meat, cornbread, and a precious map showing the route north. Amara emerged from the cabin, moving with the fluid strength of someone fully healed. Her eyes were sharp, alert to every shadow. "They're coming," she said quietly. "I heard dogs in the night." Ruth nodded grimly. "We should leave now, while we still can." "No." Amara's voice was firm. "I'm done running. This ends here." "Child, that's not wise." "I'm not your child," Amara said, but gently. "I'm your sister." And I won't bring destruction to your door by leading them north to the other stations. Ruth studied her face, seeing the iron determination there. Finally, she sighed. Then we fight together. I know these woods better than any hunter. They worked quickly in the growing light. Amara had learned much about traps during her 2 years of flight. Not just how to avoid them, but how to set them. She and Ruth dug shallow pits along the likely approach route, lining them with sharpened stakes and concealing them with branches and leaves. Between 2 ancient oaks, they strung rope at neck height, nearly invisible in the dim forest. Ruth showed Amara where the ground was soft enough to trap horses' hooves, and where thorny vines could be woven into natural barriers. The dogs will come first, Amara said as they worked. Then the men on foot, with the mounted ones behind. She spoke from bitter experience, her hands never stopping as she sharpened more stakes. Ruth nodded. We'll need to deal with the dogs quickly, or they'll give away our position. She pulled a small packet from her apron. Powdered hot pepper. Won't kill them, but they won't be able to track anything after getting a nose full. By mid-morning, they had transformed the peaceful woods into a deadly maze. They heard the first baying of hounds in the distance. Time to split up, Amara said. You circle behind them. I'll draw them in. Ruth gripped her arm. Be careful, sister. Amara managed a grim smile. Always am. She moved through the trees with practiced silence, making just enough noise to draw the dogs forward. The pepper powder worked exactly as Ruth had promised. The leading hounds went from eager hunting to confused whining, pawing at their noses and sneezing violently. The first hunter fell into a pit trap with a satisfying cry of shock and pain. The second triggered the rope trap, catching him across the chest and throwing him backward. Amara heard cursing, calls for caution, the sound of men spreading out to search more carefully. A twig snapped behind her. She spun, but too late. The scarred hunter emerged from behind a tree, rifle aimed at her chest. His face was twisted by the burn she'd given him 2 years ago. Found you, he growled. You did, Amara agreed calmly, but finding isn't catching. She dove as he fired, the bullet splintering bark where she'd stood. Rolling to her feet, she sprinted deeper into the woods, leading him away from Ruth's position. He followed, just as she'd planned. The chase took them into a dense stretch of forest where the morning light barely penetrated. Amara moved surely, knowing every root and branch they'd prepared. The hunter was forced to slow down, watching for traps. You've cost me 2 years of my life, he called out. Made me a laughingstock, the slave who marked me and got away. You chose to hunt me, Amara answered, her voice seeming to come from everywhere in the gloom. You chose to make me your obsession, because you're mine to catch. I belong to no one. She circled behind him as he crashed through the underbrush. His breathing was heavy, harsh with frustration. When he stepped into the small clearing, she was ready. Amara launched herself from a low branch, taking him down hard. The rifle went flying. They rolled across the forest floor, each fighting for dominance. He was stronger, but she was quicker, more desperate. Her elbow caught his jaw. His fist grazed her ribs. Finally, she managed to get on top, pinning him with her knee on his chest, her hands around his throat. The scar tissue was rough under her fingers. Do it, he spat. Prove you're the animal they say you are. Amara's hands tightened for a moment. It would be so easy. After everything she'd suffered, everything he'd put her through, no one would blame her. But Samuel's face flashed in her mind. She remembered his gentle heart, how he'd refused to let cruelty change him. She thought of Ruth, who fought not with violence but with courage and compassion. Slowly, deliberately, she released her grip. I am free, she said clearly, and you cannot take that from me. Not with chains, not with dogs, not with death. She stood up, backing away from him. Go home, Hunter. Your prey is gone. He lay there, staring at her with confusion and something like fear. For the first time, she saw him clearly. Just a man, twisted by hatred and pride, made small by his own choices. Dawn was breaking over the swamp as Amara made her way back to Ruth. The air was thick with mist, turning the trees into gray shadows. She found Ruth waiting at the edge of the woods, tense with worry. Bodies lay scattered through the trees, some groaning, some silent, but none dead. They had chosen their traps carefully, meant to stop rather than kill. Ruth's face broke into a relieved smile when she saw Amara. She held out her hand. "Ready?" Amara took it, feeling the strength in Ruth's weathered fingers. "Ready." Together, they stepped onto the narrow trail that led north, leaving behind the battlefield of broken men and shattered pride. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of promise. Weeks melted into a blur of secret movement. Amara and Ruth followed hidden trails through dense forests, guided by a network of helpers who passed them from safe house to safe house. Each step took them further from the land of chains, though Amara's muscles remained tense, expecting pursuit around every bend. The journey tested them in new ways. They crossed swollen rivers on moonless nights, the current threatening to sweep them away. They huddled in root cellars as patrols passed overhead, holding their breath until the thunder of hooves faded. They walked until their feet bled, then walked further still. Their guides changed regularly. An elderly white Quaker couple, a free black ferryman, a young Irish woman with fierce eyes. Each one knew only their small part of the route, making the network harder to break. They spoke in codes, packages for people, stations for safe houses, conductors for guides. "How many have you helped?" Amara asked Ruth one night as they rested in a barn's hayloft. The autumn wind whistled through the slats. "I stopped counting," Ruth replied softly. "Each one carries a piece of my heart north, but none quite like you, sister." They moved mainly at night, learning to read the stars as their compass. During the day, they hid and slept in shifts. Amara noticed the air growing cooler, the leaves turning brilliant colors before falling. They were moving into regions she'd never seen, where even the trees looked different. Their final guide was a tall man named John, his gray hair hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. He led them through a maze of trails that seemed to double back on themselves, always alert for pursuit. "The border's close now," he told them one evening, pointing north. "2 more days if we're careful. 1 if we're lucky." That night, the first snow began to fall. Amara watched the flakes drift down, catching them in her palm. They melted instantly, like tears she'd never allowed herself to shed. Ruth squeezed her hand in understanding. The next day's journey was the hardest yet. The snow made the ground treacherous, hiding roots and holes that could twist an ankle. The cold bit through their worn clothes, and their breath came in visible puffs. But something had changed in the air, a lightness, a sense of possibility that made their tired legs move faster. "There," John whispered, as they crested a small rise. "That's Canada." Amara stared at the snow-covered landscape ahead. It looked no different from what they'd passed through. The same trees, the same white blanket covering everything. But knowing what it meant made her legs shake. She took 1 step forward, then another. The snow crunched under her feet. 20 more steps. 50. She wasn't counting, but each one felt momentous. And then, without ceremony or fanfare, they crossed the invisible line that marked the border. Amara felt it in her bones, though there was no physical sign. Here, the law could not touch her. Here, no one owned her body or her labor. Here, she was truly, legally, irrevocably free. Her legs gave way. She fell to her knees in the snow, not feeling the cold. Snowflakes landed on her upturned face, kissing the scars left by 2 years of running. They melted on her cheeks, mixing with tears she could finally release. Ruth knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around Amara's shoulders. They held each other, swaying slightly as John kept watch with respectful distance. "My mother died in chains," Amara whispered. "Samuel died in chains, but I—" Her voice broke. "You broke them," Ruth finished. "You broke them for all of them." Amara touched the snow, letting it pile in her palm. She had nothing. No family waiting, no home to return to, no possessions beyond the clothes she wore. But she had this moment, this victory bought with blood, and courage, and endless determination. She had her freedom, and no one could take that away. They walked on as the snow continued to fall, heading toward the safe house John knew. Amara's body felt lighter with each step, as if she'd set down a burden she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its weight. The safe house appeared through the swirling snow, a solid wooden building with smoke rising from its chimney. Light glowed in the windows, warm and welcoming. Other fugitives would pass through here, Amara knew, each carrying their own stories of survival. She stopped at the threshold, her hand resting on the rough wooden doorframe. It felt solid, real, sacred in its ordinary stability. This was no master's door she had to knock on with head bowed. This was a door she could walk through standing tall. "At last," she whispered, her words carried away by the snowy wind. "Free!" Ruth stood beside her, patient and understanding. John waited a few steps back, giving them this moment. The snow fell steadily, covering their tracks, erasing the path that had led them here. Ahead lay a future Amara had never dared to imagine, one where she could choose her own path, speak her own truth, live her own life. The door opened, spilling golden light onto the snow. Warm air carried the smell of cooking food and wood smoke. Inside, she could hear voices talking and laughing freely. Ruth took her hand, and together they stepped over the threshold, leaving behind the cold and darkness of their long journey. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have hand-picked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.